I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. I had to free up some space on my phone, so we're going to have to finish up this chapter before we start the next one. For a few seconds, it was a toss-up whether I would laugh, imagine being named Hallelujah, or cry, imagine letting some white woman rename you for her convenience. My anger saved me from either outburst. I had to quit the job. But the problem was going to be how to do it. Mama wouldn't allow me to quit for just any reason. She's a peach. That woman is a real peach. Mrs. Randall's maid was talking as she took the soup from me, and I wondered what her name used to be and what she answered to now. For a week I looked into Mrs. Cullinan's face as she called me Mary. She ignored my coming late and leaving early. Miss Glory was a little annoyed because I had begun to leave egg yolk on the dishes and wasn't putting much heart in polishing the silver. I hoped that she would complain to our boss, but she didn't. Then Bailey solved my dilemma. He had me describe the contents of the cupboard and the particular plates she liked best. Her favorite piece was a casserole shaped like a fish and the green glass coffee cups. I kept his instructions in mind. So on the next day, when Miss Glory was hanging out clothes and I had again been told to serve the old biddies on the porch, I dropped the empty serving tray. Then I heard Miss Cullinan scream, "Mary!" I picked up the casserole and 2 of the green glass cups in readiness. As she rounded the kitchen door, I let them fall on the tiled floor. I could never absolutely describe to Bailey what happened next, because each time I got to the part where she fell to the floor and screwed up her ugly face to cry, we burst out laughing. She actually wobbled around on the floor and picked up shards of the cups and cried, "Oh, Mama. Oh, dear God. It's Mama's china from Virginia. Oh, Mama. I sorry." Miss Glory came running in from the yard, and the women from the porch crowded around Miss Glory. Was almost as broken up as her mistress. "You mean to say she broke our Virginia dishes? What we gonna do?" Mrs. Cullinan cried louder, "That clumsy nigger, clumsy little black nigger." Old Speckled Face leaned down and asked, "Who did it, Viola? Was it Mary? Who did it?" Everything was happening so fast I can't remember whether her action preceded her words, but I know that Mrs. Cullinan said, "Her name's Margaret, goddammit. Her name's Margaret." And she threw a wedge of the broken plate at me. It could have been the hysteria which put her aim off, but the flying crockery caught Miss Glory right over her ear, and she started screaming. I left the front door wide open so all the neighbors could hear. Mrs. Cullinan was right about one thing. My name wasn't Mary. Now we're on chapter 17, which is page 109. Weekdays revolved on a sameness wheel. They turned into themselves so steadily and inevitably that each seemed to be the original of yesterday's rough draft. Saturdays, however, always broke the mold and dared to be different. Farmers trekked into town with their children and wives, streaming around them. Their broad, stiff khaki pants and shirts revealed the painstaking care of a dutiful daughter or wife. They often stopped at the store to get change for bills, so they could give out jangling coins to their children, who shook with their eagerness to get to town. The young kids openly resented their parents dawdling in the store, and Uncle Willie would call them in and spread among them bits of sweet peanut patties that had been broken in shipping. They gobbled down the candies and were out again, kicking up the powdery dust in the road and worrying if there was going to be time to get to town after all. Bailey played I'll give this a try. Mumble die peg with the older boys around the chinaberry tree. and Mama and Uncle Willie listened to the farmer's latest news on the country. The farmer's latest news of the country. I thought of myself as hanging in the store, a mote imprisoned on a shaft of sunlight, pushed and pulled by the slightest shift of air, but never falling free into the tempting darkness. In the warm months, morning began with a quick wash of unheated well water. The suds were dashed on a plot of ground beside the kitchen door. It was called the bait garden. Bailey raised worms. After prayers, breakfast in summer was usually dry cereal and fresh milk. Then our chores, which on Saturday included weekday jobs, scrubbing the floors, raking the yards, polishing our shoes for Sunday. Uncle Willie had to be shined with a biscuit, and attending to the customers who came breathlessly also in their Saturday hurry. Looking through the years, I marvel that Saturday was my favorite day of the week. What pleasures could have been squeezed between the fun folds of unending tasks. Children's talent to endure stems from their ignorance of alternatives. After our retreat from St. Louis, Mama gave us a weekly allowance. Since she seldom dealt with money other than to take it in and to tithe to the church, I suppose that the weekly 10 cents was to tell us that even she realized that a change had come over us and that our new unfamiliarity caused her to treat us with a strangeness. I usually gave my money to Bailey, who went to the movies nearly every Saturday. He brought back Street and Smith cowboy books for me. One Saturday, Bailey was late coming back from the Rialto. Mama had begun heating water for the Saturday night baths, and all the evening chores were done. Uncle Willie sat in the twilight on the front porch, mumbling or maybe singing and smoking a ready-made. It was quite late. Mothers had called in their children from the group games, and fading sounds of "ya, you didn't catch me" still hung and floated into the store. Uncle Willie said, "Sister, better light the light." On Saturdays, we used the electric lights so that last-minute shoppers could look down the hill and see if the store was open. Mama hadn't told me to turn them on because she didn't want to believe that night had fallen hard and Bailey was still out in the ungodly dark. Her apprehension was evident in the hurried movements around the kitchen and in her lonely, fearing eyes. The black woman in the South who raises sons, grandsons, and nephews had her heartstrings tied to a hanging noose. Any break from routine may herald for them unbearable news. For this reason, Southern blacks, until the present generation, could be counted among America's arch conservatives. Like most self-pitying people, I had very little pity for my relatives' anxiety. If something indeed had happened to Bailey, Uncle Willie would always have Mama, and Mama had the store. Then, after all, we weren't their children, but I would be the major loser if Bailey turned up dead, for he was all I claimed, if not all I had. The bath water was steaming on the cooking stove, but Mama was scrubbing the kitchen table for the umpteenth time. Mama, Uncle Willie called, and she jumped. "Mama!" I waited in the bright lights of the store, jealous that someone had come along and told these strangers something about my brother, and I would be the last to know. "Mama, why don't you and Sister walk down to meet him?" To my knowledge, Bailey's name hadn't been mentioned for hours, but we all knew whom he meant. Of course, why didn't that occur to me? I wanted to be gone. Mama said, Wait a minute, little lady. Go get your sweater and bring me my shawl. It was darker in the road than I'd thought it would be. Mama swung the flashlight arc over the path and weeds and scary tree trunks. The night suddenly became enemy territory, and I knew that if my brother was lost in this land, he was forever lost. He was 11 and very smart, that I granted, but after all, he was so small. The bluebeards and tigers and rippers could eat him up before he could scream for help. Mama told me to take the light, and she reached for my hand. Her voice came from a high hill above me, and in the dark my hand was enclosed in hers. I loved her with a rush. She said nothing. No, don't worry, or don't get tender-hearted. Just the gentle pressure of her rough hand conveyed her own concern and assurance to me. We passed houses which I knew well by daylight, but couldn't recollect in the swarthy gloom. Evening, Miss Jenkins, walking and pulling me along. Sister Henderson, anything wrong? That was from an outline blacker than the night. No, ma'am, not a thing. Bless the Lord. By the time she finished speaking, we had left the worried neighbors far behind. Mr. Willie Williams' Dewdrop Inn was bright with furry red lights in the distance, and the pond's fishy smell enveloped us. Mama's hand tightened and let go, and I saw the small figure plodding along, tired and old-mannish. Hands in his pockets and head bent, he walked like a man trudging up the hill behind a coffin. Bailey. It jumped out as Mama said, Jew, and I started to run, but her hand caught mine again and became a vice. I pulled, but she yanked me back to her side. We'll walk, just like we've been walking, young lady. There was no chance to warn Bailey that he was dangerously late, that everybody had been worried, and that he should create a good lie, or better, a great one. Mama said, Bailey Jr., and he looked up without surprise. You know it's night, and you just now getting home? Yes, ma'am. He was empty. Where was his alibi? What you been doing? Nothing. That's all you got to say? Yes, ma'am. All right, young man. We'll see when we get home. We'll see when you get home. She had turned me loose, so I made a grab for Bailey's hand, but he snatched it away. I said, Hey, Bale, hoping to remind him that I was his sister and his only friend, but he grumbled something like, Leave me alone. Mama didn't turn on the flashlight on the way back, nor did she answer the questioning good evenings that floated around us as we passed the darkened houses. I was confused and frightened. He was going to get a whipping, and maybe he had done something terrible. If he couldn't talk to me, it must have been serious. But there was no air of spent revelry about him. He just seemed sad. I didn't know what to think. Uncle Willie said, Getting too big for your britches, huh? You can't come home? You want to worry your grandmother to death? Bailey was so far away, he was beyond fear. Uncle Willie had a leather belt in his good hand, but Bailey didn't notice or didn't care. I'm going to whip you this time. Our uncle had only whipped us once before, and then only with a peach tree switch. So maybe now he was going to kill my brother. I screamed and grabbed for the belt, but Mama caught me. Now don't get uppity, miss, lest you want some of the same thing. He got a lesson coming to him. You come on and get your bath. From the kitchen, I heard the belt fall down, dry and raspy on naked skin. Uncle Willie was gasping for breath, but Bailey made no sound. I was too afraid to splash water or even to cry and take a chance of drowning out Bailey's pleas for help. But the pleas never came, and the whipping was finally over. I lay awake an eternity, waiting for a sign, a whimper, or a whisper from the next room that he was still alive. Just before I fell exhausted into sleep, I heard Bailey. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. My last memory of that night was the question, why is he saying the baby prayer? We had been saying, Our Father which art in heaven, for years. For days the store was a strange country, and we were all newly arrived immigrants. Bailey didn't talk, smile, or apologize. His eyes were so vacant it seemed his soul had flown away. And at meals, I tried to give him the best pieces of meat and the largest portion of dessert, but he turned them down. Then one evening, at the pig pen, he said without warning, I saw Mother dear. If he said it, it was bound to be the truth. He wouldn't lie to me. I don't think I asked him where or when. In the movies. He laid his head on the wooden railing. It wasn't really her. It was a woman named Kay Francis. She's a white movie star who looks just like Mama dear. There was no difficulty believing that a white movie star looked like our mother, and that Bailey had seen her. He told me that the movies were changed each week, but when another picture came to stamps starring Kay Francis, he would tell me and we'd go together. He even promised to sit with me. He had stayed late on a previous Saturday to see the film over again. I understood, and understood too why he couldn't tell Mama or Uncle Willie. She was our mother and belonged to us. She was never mentioned to anyone because we simply didn't have enough of her to share. We had to wait nearly 2 months before Kay Francis returned to stamps. Bailey's mood had lightened considerably, but he lived in a state of expectation, and it made him more nervous than he was usually. When he told me that the movie would be shown, we went into our best behavior and were the exemplary children that grandmother deserved and wished to think us. Exemplary children that grandmother deserved and wished to think us. It was a gay, light comedy, and Kay Francis wore long-sleeved white silk shirts with big cufflinks. Her bedroom was all satin and flowers in vases, and her maid, who was black, went around saying, "Lawsy, missy," all the time. There was a Negro chauffeur, too, who rolled his eyes and scratched his head, and I wondered how on earth an idiot like that could be trusted with her beautiful cars. The white folks downstairs laughed every few minutes, throwing the discarded Snicker up to the Negroes in the buzzard's roost. The sound would jag around in our air for an indecisive second before the balcony's occupants accepted it and sent their own guffaws to riot with it against the walls of the theater. I laughed too, but not at the hateful jokes made on my people. I laughed because, except she was white, the big movie star looked just like my mother, except that she lived in a big mansion with 1,000 servants. She lived just like my mother, and it was funny to think of the white folks not knowing that the woman they were adoring could be my mother's twin, except that she was white. And my mother was prettier, much prettier. The movie star made me happy. It was extraordinary good fortune to be able to save up one's money and go see one's mother whenever one wanted to. I bounced out of the theater as if I'd been given an unexpected present, but Bailey was cast down again. I had to beg him not to stay for me for the next show. On the way home, he stopped at the railroad tracks and waited for the night freight train. Just before it reached the crossing, he tore out and ran across the tracks. I was left on the other side in hysteria. Maybe the giant wheels were grinding his bones into a bloody mush. Maybe he tried to catch a boxcar and got flung into the pond and drowned. Or even worse, maybe he caught the train and was forever gone. When the train passed, he pushed himself away from the pole where he had been leaning, berated me for making all that noise, and said, "Let's go home." 1 year later, he did catch a freight, but because of his youth and the inscrutable ways of fate, he didn't find California and his mother dear. He got stranded in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, for 2 weeks. And that's the end of chapter 17.